of a bitch up, or you want to move, or I have to kick you?
These people are in a rage over trees, old trees. Some people want to cut them for lumber. Others want to save them.
No way!
Will this 400-year-old tree be cut up for lumber or left standing? My name is Paul Newman. When settlers first came to North America, ancient forests covered much of the continent. Our forefathers cut and burned trees to clear the land. Then came the loggers who cut and moved on. Today, only 2% of the original ancient forests are left. Most of these forests are in the Pacific Northwest. There, almost 2 square miles of trees are cut down each week. Will the remaining ancient forests continue to be cut, or should they be protected? That is the question.
This Audubon special is made possible by the people of GE. GE, from satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life.
I live in accordance with man's laws too, but I'm also listening to God's laws right now, and we're raping the earth, and it's not right.
You're sick. You're all sick. So now you don't want them logging? You live in a mobile home made out of wood. Your paychecks are printed on paper pulp. And now you're down here protesting a man making a living.
A family outraged by logging near their home take the law into their own hands.
They're cutting dying trees. Do you know why they're dying? The U.S. forestry guy said to me, the reason why they're...
You be quiet and listen to me.
You be quiet.
But the confrontation over ancient trees reaches far beyond this Oregon family. The conflict over whether we are going to cut these forests or save them for future generations reaches to the heart of our society's values. The battle comes into focus in this pristine valley. Opal Creek watershed in Oregon is only 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. The valley is filled with ancient, old-growth trees up to 800 years old and 200 feet high. Forest Service scientists have identified Opal Creek as the last low-elevation, uncut watershed in Oregon and asked for its preservation. But Forest Service administrators want to sell the timber. This valley is part of a national forest, but 2 men have very different plans for its future. Rob Freris, vice president of Freris Lumber Company, wants to log Opal Creek and is worried about Forest Service proposals to reduce record high-level timber sales in Oregon.
Oregon doesn't have the ability to diversify to such a great degree in such short order that would not cause a catastrophic economic effect.
George Atiyah spent much of his youth in Opal Creek Valley, and for 3 generations, his family has fought to keep the loggers out. Atiyah would like to see the valley saved as a state or national park.
Industry says we got to keep cutting these trees down because we got to preserve jobs and support our economy in the state of Oregon. But what everybody's got to realize is we're out of these guys, and whether we quit cutting them now and leave a few of them left or wait 5 more years or 10 more years till they're all gone, the party's over.
The battle in the Pacific Northwest is part of a struggle that is, in fact, nationwide. There are 156 national forests. As plans are made for the future of these forests, conservationists and the timber industry battle over how much forest to cut and how much to protect. Nowhere are there stronger differences of opinion than in the Willamette National Forest and Opal Creek. In Oregon, industry practice calls for clear-cutting thousands of acres at the same time. Private owners have cut nearly all the ancient forests on their land. The U.S. Forest Service sells national forest timber in swatches of 10 to 60 acres. To access the timber, the Forest Service has already built or permitted enough logging roads to reach the moon, and plans for 100,000 miles more. Cutting these valleys helps mill owners like Rob Ferris prosper, and many towns have grown up around mills. People in these towns depend on the mills for jobs. Besides, county governments get up to 1/2 of the proceeds of federal forest sales to spend on schools and roads. On the other hand, tourism is one of Oregon's largest industries, and natural beauty is the attraction. But as clear cuts degrade the view around popular resort areas, threatening wildlife and watersheds, more and more citizens like Atia are protesting. Jim Monteith, who was born in Oregon, has made saving ancient forests, which are called old growth, his life work. He is executive director of the Oregon Natural Resources Council.
I grew up in southern Oregon in an area that was full of bald eagles and big trees and all the things that I thought everybody grew up with. When it came time to go to college, I went far away. I went to the East Coast to see what that was like, and it was only then I realized what it was that I had grown up with and how rare and how unique it is.
Monteith began studying fishers, a fur-bearing animal dependent on old growth, but found long-term studies were impossible because the forests and fishers were disappearing faster than he could study them.
I was outraged, realizing that I couldn't even be a scientist, and I then went to work for a conservation organization and realize now that the decisions that we make in the next year or so are going to dictate whether or not we're going to have any of these cathedral forests left in 5 or 10 years. The decision is now.
As Monteith travels around Oregon, he finds that some people applaud his campaign, and some people can scarcely tolerate it. People in the timber industry think the policies he proposes would ruin the economy of Oregon. Following Monteith around Oregon, watching people's strong reactions to him, pro and con, is a direct way of appreciating the feelings of Oregonians about their ancient forests. When Monteith visits Ferris Mills, he gets a direct exposure to the industry point of view. Ferris's company owns no forests. His mills are completely dependent on timber from public land.
And the reason that we advocate harvesting old growth, you see here, this is all defect, here, here, and here, and it is virtually unsound. We advocate harvesting the oldest and the worst timber first and replacing it with a vibrant, young, healthy stand. And we feel this is proper forest management. This mill is designed to manufacture old growth logs. The raw material source is the public timber supply. We don't have any alternative. It's this size timber, and this is what we're operating on, and will for probably the rest of my life. This veneer is destined for the western part of Oregon and Washington. We're building markets to ship veneer to Japan and the Far East.
Is there a difference in quality in the veneer from the older ones and the young ones? I would assume there is, but I'm not sure.
The older growth veneers can be used for a multitude of products that can't be made out of second growth. The clear wood that you get on the outside of an old growth tree, the high grade, isn't found in a second growth log.
Right.
The Willamette National Forest provides enough wood products for 1 in 50 houses built in America each and every year, and can do so indefinitely. There are 70 rural Oregon towns that have mills as their major employer. to eliminate old growth harvesting or cutting it back would be the death knell to these communities. The planer shavings would go to a company like Duraflake and they make particle board out of it.
I see. And your hog fuel comes from garbage?
Bark.
All bark.
Yeah.
Very efficient.
No, we wouldn't be here if we weren't.
But as the average size tree comes down, which is the trend, how small can they get before this mill can't handle them?
We will modify our plants accordingly and have through time to match the raw material source. But
it seems that at some point you need to be planning to make that conversion, and I guess the debate that we get into centers around whether or not you ought to make it sooner than you think you should, and
we'll make it as the tree size shrinks, as nature dictates.
We also, of course, see some value in that old forest being there.
The old growth is the only supply on the Detroit district. It makes up 89% of the timber here. It's going to be here forever, and it's going to be a supply that we'll always have.
Forever?
Forever.
It's hard to believe that trees this big will be here forever. Maybe if we grow them to be that big, but we're growing them to be smaller. What will you do if you get to that point where you can't have this size log?
They don't grow smaller, they grow bigger.
Dr. Jerry Franklin is a Forest Service scientist and a University of Washington professor. He has been studying old growth for 20 years and is the foremost U.S. authority on ancient forests.
There are some people who are totally utilitarian, and if they aren't putting it to use in some very practical, human-directed way, they aren't happy with it.
The impression that one gets is that we have plenty of them and they're everywhere and there's no issue, and there's no problem. And that's part of the problem we're having is making clear that old growth per se is a very limited resource.
It is interesting that the rate of timber cutting that's going on here in Oregon, Washington, actually exceeds the percentage in terms of the rate of cutover that's going on in the tropical regions. And so, we hear all the time about the rate of deforestation of the tropical forest, and it's tremendous, and it's a catastrophe. But we have a much higher rate of forest cutting going on here in the Pacific Northwest. So all you got to do is fly over the landscape, and you have a real appreciation of how rapidly we're cutting it over. So Brazil has nothing on the Northwest.
Opal Creek flows out of a lake only 3,500 feet in elevation, which makes the valley particularly valuable, since there are no other low-elevation, largely intact watersheds in Oregon. In its lower reaches, Opal Creek provides local residents with a spectacular swimming hole. Away from the crowd and road, far up the valley at Opal Lake, is an area where solitude can be found.
Nice, huh?
George Attia has tried to instill in his children the inspiration and sense of fulfillment he feels in the midst of a cathedral forest. He takes them hiking and shares with them a favorite camping site that he discovered for himself as a boy. Attia is also a pilot and takes every opportunity to show visitors the difference between Opal Creek and the cutover valleys that surround it on three sides.
I'm going to swing back here and we'll show you Opal Lake, and then we'll come right on down the valley. Okay, when we drop down here, it's hard to believe because you can't, when you get below the ridge, you can't see the clear cuts anymore, and it's hard to imagine that we have devastation all around us and we're in this beautiful pocket. really kind of tears me up when I think this is the last one. I mean, this is the only valley that hasn't totally been fragmented and destroyed. God's pocket.
Solid big timber. This is what the whole Cascade Range used to look like.
Yep.
You know, there must have been 200 valleys like this in the Western Cascades at one time.
More than that.
This is really special, George.
Yeah.
If this were anywhere else, it'd be a national park.
And Robbie Ramirez wonders if I'm going to fight to keep this. That's what I could not believe. Now, as we come up here in a second, we're going to leave this valley. Thousands of miles of roads, clear cuts everywhere. You can see they just put roads everywhere. It just pretty much destroyed the whole valley. Giant mess.
That's really the problem, George, is that the mill capacity outpaces the forest capacity. And they just can't understand that.
They're just chewing it up as fast as they can. Looks like a volcano went off or a nuclear bomb. It's total devastation. Look right here behind us. If we could take all the people in the United States and fly them over this place, we'd have a revolution. Congress is just selling our heritage.
You know, George, every time I get up in the air, I realize that we've been understating the problem. I always worry about that. It's even worse than we think it is.
George Atiyah manages a small silver mine halfway up the valley. He grew up with a wilderness for inspiration and playground.
It's really not too much for a kid to get in trouble doing up there, so I took off one day with my fly pole and started hiking up Opal Creek just to discover it. And I got up there and I was just awed, even at 11 years old, by the beauty of the place and the size of the trees and the whole thing. I was just radiant, I guess, when I got back to the camp telling everybody what I discovered. And then they told me that the Forest Service was planning on logging it. And I made up my mind then that I wasn't going to let it happen. And I was told that there was nothing I could do about it.
At the age of 12?
At the age of 12.
You've spent, you say, 20 years now?
20 years trying to keep them from logging Opal Creek. If enough people see what they're going to lose, then the Forest Service will never be able to cut it.
An ancient forest is nature's unique creation, a special world where people like Atiyah feel a sense of almost sacred awe. Huge ancient trees rise 20 stories high. A broken canopy of trees allows sunlight to penetrate and stimulate plants for deer and elk. Dead snags offer nesting places for birds. Fallen timber provides shelter for small creatures and nutrients for the soil. When these ancient trees are cut, new trees will grow. But it would take at least 200 years before the forest again begins to take on these characteristics. Besides, there are no Forest Service plans to let forests grow this old again. It would take 1,000 years for trees this large to grow again. Opal Creek has attracted many people besides Atia. Local residents have volunteered to help any way they can. Some join the Forest Service to build footpaths.
These are the toe stubbers, and I carry these along so that I can get these out of the trail as well. And we try to keep this side of the trail lower so that water doesn't wash off that side of the trail, and that people will walk toward this part of the trail and not cause that to break away.
I think we ought to be out here building trails, but I think the Forest Service ought to be out here building trails too. And we like the fact that they're cooperating with us and helping us plan it, but the reason that we're doing this at all is because they don't have funds.
I'd rather build trail any day than keep house. But this is my heart's home out here.
In the next 10 years, the Willamette Plan right now proposes to build 20 miles of trail and something like 1,000 miles of roads.
How many miles of trails do you suppose you'll lose over that same time period? Any idea, just from roads and clear cuts on top of this trail?
About 180 miles of trail or something like that will be disrupted by roading in the next 10 years. We got 20 miles of new trail, we're going to lose 180 miles of existing trail.
I've taken my grandchildren backpacking up here. My granddaughter was 6.5 and her little brother was 2.5. And we came backpacking up here and we've done it ever since. My granddaughter will be a senior in college next year, so you know how important a place this is to us. I also have in my will that my ashes be sprinkled in the Opal Pool. They're trying to log the old growth in this drainage, and it really needs protection. And this is one place where I could lay down in front of a logging truck and feel okay. I don't approve of that sort of activism usually, but for this place I could.
As part of his campaign to save Opal Creek Valley, George Atia encourages visitors from all over the country.
Actually, the one behind us is Bull of the Woods roadless area, and then this is Opal Creek roadless area. They want to build a road, a mid-slope road, around and then harvest that over on that side.
You know, I've always objected to that word harvest. Harvest implies you've nurtured something and cared for it, and then you cut it and it grows back. This is mining. You mine a forest like this, it never comes back.
That's exactly
the
what
trees are never going to come back 6 feet thick and 200 feet high, and that's not harvesting.
That's right.
That's an industry public relations term they devised 20 years ago to make it sound better because they're ashamed of what they're doing. When I tell people back east, you know, they're cutting on your public forest trees 6 feet thick and 200 feet high, and they're down to the last of it. They can't believe it.
I've seen people come from back east and they didn't even know that they cut in the national forest. They thought they were national parks or like that. To me, it's like somebody who got an inheritance and they went out and had a big party with it and blew it all at once. And then they went there at the end and they don't have anything left and go, gee whiz, where'd it go? What happened?
The two principles that I feel are very important for a land steward are, first of all, that you don't reduce the capacity of the land to produce. You don't reduce its long-term productivity. You don't mine it. The second ethic is that you don't extirpate species. At least you don't knowingly and willfully eliminate species in our ecosystems. And I think, you know, the old growth issue is strongly related to both of those ethical principles.
Researchers have found 160 species closely associated with old growth. The northern spotted owl and threats to its survival have become a central issue in the fight over ancient forests. In 1973, Eric Forsman, then a graduate student, discovered that the northern spotted owl needs old growth forests to survive. Forsman is now a Forest Service biologist. Harriet Allen studies the owl for Washington State's Department of Wildlife.
Because we don't know very much about a lot of the species that occur in the forests out here in terms of their ecology or the effects of timber harvest upon them, The spotted owl is often used as an indicator species.
It's our barometer, an indicator of the health of the ecosystem, like the canary in the coal mine. When things go wrong for the canary, it's an indication that things are wrong for being in the coal mine. It will give us an indication of what may be happening to other species that live in old-growth forest ecosystem. The decisions that are made today, as far as how much old growth is left, is going to determine the fate of the species and whether it does indeed survive.
Forsman and Allen's research has shown that each pair of owls requires up to 3 square miles of ancient forest to survive. Conservationists have held up timber sales by suing the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management to set aside forest for the owl's protection. Often, forestmen can locate the owls with a whistle.
The idea is to just watch where he flies to with the mouse down. Like right now, you can hear him whistling up the slope there. He's calling for the female to see where she's at. And we just follow him and see where he goes, and usually they'll take us right to the young. Okay, we need to keep our eyes open as we walk up the hill here because we may be able to spot them even before we hear them if they don't call. Just kind of keep your eyes open. There's the male right there. Pick out which one of them's got the bands on. These guys are probably not very hungry. Otherwise, if they're hungry, they usually start to beg. It's kind of a high-pitched rasping sound there. Well, he just sort of acts like he doesn't really care. If they begged, she'd probably take the mouse right to him, but they're not acting hungry, so she's just kind of sitting up there wondering if she needs to feed him or not. There we go.
Yeah, oh yes. There we go.
Forsman and Allen banned the young owls to follow their movement.
Okay, come on. Come on, let go.
Come on off the limb.
Let go. The popping sound you hear is the beak. They snap the beak. It's a threat. When they're frightened or angry, they pop their beak at you. It's supposed to scare you.
In the past, species that have gone extinct to a large extent have been due to man's ignorance. But in this case, it will be deliberate decision-making.
I don't really blame so much the decision makers and politicians because in a democratic society, basically they are responding to the will of the people. And from my perspective, in situations like this, where there's a constant increasing demand for lumber, for resources from everyone. Basically, we're all the problem, and the enemy is us.
Maybe the decisions that are being made by some of the politicians are from a small portion of the public, that the vast majority of the public has not been participating in the decision-making on this issue because they're not aware of it. And hopefully they will become aware of it and have more participation.
Definitely true. Whoever makes the loudest noise is, whichever groups make the loudest noises, they're the ones who the politicians and administrators respond to. So.
fate of giant trees is controversial even within the timber industry. In 1988, large timber companies, which own their own forest, shipped abroad 1/4 of the logs cut in the Northwest, primarily to Korea, China, and Japan. Smaller mill owners say that these exports are wrong and that shipping raw logs abroad destroys mill jobs that could boost employment at home. In the Northwest, unmilled logs shipped abroad in 1988 represent a loss of up to 16,000 possible jobs. The United States is the only country in the world which permits massive export of raw logs. Congress not only permits these sales, but has refused to permit Oregon or other states to limit them. Timber companies are cutting more trees than ever. Nonetheless, as companies invest in ever more sophisticated machines, employment in the timber industry keeps going down. Automation costs jobs. Log export costs jobs. Setting aside forest land costs jobs. Workers who can't control the rate of automation or log export see no way out except to keep on cutting ancient forests as long as they last.
My grandfather, my father, and I've all worked in the timber industry. I like the job, I like the work, I like to cut trees. But I don't think that all the old growth ought to be cut. But the amount that should be saved is a point of argument. Trees is the only thing that you can plant and is going to grow back. You use the coal out of the ground, it's going to take a long time for it to grow back. You use oil, it don't grow back very fast. And trees is the only thing that if you cut one down and you plant two more, you've got a 80% chance of one of those getting big enough to cut it down again in 80 years. Right. And if we stop the project just so we can sit and look at it, just look at the trees,
Bob Zeke is an old-time logger. Now he feels very differently about the part he once played in cutting down the big trees. The stumps here are the remains of an ancient forest, and the second growth timber on this land has also been cut.
I would have liked to have walked through this area when it was a virgin forest. I never saw these trees. They were cut at about the time I was born. When I was 18, that's when they would allow a young man to be involved in the logging because of the dangers. I stayed in there all of these years up until 1974 when I retired. I'm aware of the loggers' life, the sweat, the cold, the freezing weather that you're in, the kind of pay that they get, the dangers they're subjected to, and most of them getting crippled up one way or the other. The falling of the trees is something that you don't forget. With the hand saws, as you went into the woods, it was quiet, excepting for the silken swish, 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 swish of the saws as it worked through the tree. When the tree was about to fall, there was a call of timber, and this is what I heard. Timber, here she goes, here she goes, down the hill, timber. And then this huge tree, popping as the wood broke, would reluctantly begin to leave the stump and be on its way. This county doesn't have a single square mile of what used to be. We let it all go. I'm very much ashamed now to think that there wasn't someone around with brains enough to say, hold it, hold it, hold it. What are we going to show the people of tomorrow, the children, your children, and so on? These timberlands belong to the American people, so we can't allow any particular group say we're going to manage or handle this timber for our particular benefit. It's not for the loggers or the timber companies to choose or to make that decision.
Can conservationists and timbermen find a middle ground? The question arises when Bill Swindells, Jr., president of Willamette Industries, one of the largest timber companies in Oregon, joins Freris and Monteith at the site of a clear cut.
And no one's arguing that we should stop cutting timber, and no one's arguing that we shouldn't have wood products. We all work in the mills, we all use paper, etc. We also drink water and hunt and fish, wildlife habitat. That's why these forests are so magnificent. We should certainly not convert the whole landscape to a crop, to a wheat plantation, and act like we know what we're doing.
An old-growth forest is virtually devoid of wildlife. Oh. There are no big deer, no elk.
I can't.
There's nothing for them to eat.
There's nothing for them to eat. I believe you would say that in the 1980s.
There's nothing for them to eat.
We might have thought that 20 years ago.
But think it, you can see it. We can't raise trees because the deer eat them. We've got to put bud caps on the trees so they'll get a chance to grow.
Sure, clear cuts are great for some animals. The problem is that we have clear cuts literally everywhere. The problem is we don't have the old growth forest species are the ones that are going. That's why there's a problem with things like spotted owls. A lot of animals need the old growth forest. They're the ones that are disappearing. There's dozens and dozens of them.
What?
Everything from spotted owls to fishers to martins.
There's spotted owls all over the place.
Why is it
they're
that
finding them every day?
They never had an inventory before. Now all they're doing is looking. The Forest Service has never looked more than a mile off the roads.
In the last 5 years, people like Eric Forsman have inventoried these forests extensively. And they've gone back and they've looked at second growth. From what they found are a couple of pairs that are hanging on to the edge of existence because they have nowhere else to go. That's what the biologists have found, Robbie. That's just the way it is. It's a fact.
Oh, that's
you people.
You don't believe them? Are you just selective in what you believe? I mean, the Forest Service...
They're finding spotted owls every day, everywhere.
In old growth, they are.
And in second growth. And in barns. That's this year's issue. Next year it'll be something else. But I think what we're really talking about is the soul of Oregon there. We're going to have... my wife and I go down to the small towns in Oregon, visit old friends there, see their kids, see watch their kids grow up. We go to their graduations, their football games. We go to weddings and funerals, and we're looking forward to going back, seeing the churches boarded up and the schools shut down. And this is because 3 million acres isn't enough old growth. We've got to save more. There's plenty of timber to go around for everybody. But you can't just lock it all up. You've got to use it.
Bill, we have logged all the private lands. Virtually all the private land old growth is gone. We've logged most of the national forest.
That's an oversimplification.
In terms of it's not. In terms of what we've protected, some 3,500 feet and below, some somewhat below that high elevation true fir, we've protected about 200,000 acres, while we have logged millions of acres of old growth, including the biggest stuff.
If we accept the Forest Service preferred alternative, we're talking about eliminating 10,000 primary jobs in Oregon. If we take your recommendations, we're talking about 20,000 jobs. And each of those timber jobs, and each of those jobs creates 2 more jobs. You're talking about taking 60,000 jobs out of Oregon.
Oh, that's
just like that.
That's not true, Bill.
And they're not going to be replaced by fishing guys.
How can you say that when you've cut more timber than any year in history last year, with fewer people working? We always want an industry here. We want timber, and we want a diversified economy. You're not going to be here in 40 years if you cut at the level that the rates are.
Oh, that's nonsense.
That's complete nonsense.
Utter
nonsense. Always been that way.
You got professional foresters who have been looking at this for years. They've studied it carefully. They've got all sorts of computers and studies, and they go out and measure trees, and they say we're going to have it. Then comes along a couple of people who have never been in the woods and say, "Oh, you're going to run out of trees. We're not going to run out. The only reason we'll run out of trees is if you lock them up."
Bill, I wish that were true. Why would the Forest Service suggest that we need to cut less than we've been cutting in the past?
There's no point in trying to talk to in this conversation. I'm not going to go on with this nonsense.
The professional Forest Service that we're talking about says we cannot maintain the levels of cutting we've been experiencing on this forest.
With the reduced land allocations.
With multiple use.
First it's old growth, then it's backcountry, a different definition, a different name for the same thing to tie up timberland. There isn't anything extraordinary about Opal Creek. It's no more extraordinary than millions of acres in Oregon of old growth forest.
Why do people come to Oregon? Because of the big trees, because of the wild rivers, because of the unspoiled beaches. These are important economic components.
And nobody's taking those away.
Well, we're getting rid of the
them.
old growth as fast as we can, and we're not growing it
as
back.
fast as we can. We're cutting 1% a year. It'll be here forever.
I wish that were true.
That is
really
exactly the truth.
Well, get up in an airplane and tell me that we're cutting at 1% a year. That's just simply
exactly right.
hard to believe. Most of it's gone.
No, it's not.
Monteith and ITEA say we're running out of giant trees. Mill owners say that they will last forever. The fact is that even Forest Service scientist Jerry Franklin isn't sure how much is left, but he's willing to hazard a guess.
The timber industry is very fond of saying that we have locked up 2 million acres of old growth. What does that 2 million acres of wilderness really give us?
Well, I can tell you for sure it doesn't give you very much at all in the way of old-growth Douglas fir hemlock forests. You know the wilderness boundaries better than I do, and you know perfectly well that they've been drawn to exclude large areas of old-growth timber. And that's truer in Oregon than it is in Washington. In Washington state, there are several wilderness areas which do include low-elevation timber, but it's not true in Oregon. For all of its interest in conservation, Oregon has almost none of its legacy preserved.
How can timbermen and conservationists negotiate when they cannot even agree on the basic facts? Is an ancient forest devoid of wildlife? Is the spotted owl threatened? Industry rejects the opinion of scientist Jerry Franklin.
There isn't another forest like this in the world. You know, when you look at the complexity of the structure of these things and the tremendous dimensions, the heights of these trees and the incredible layering of leaves. You got trees here with 60, 70 million needles on them. They offer an incredible diversity in terms of animal habitat. And that's why you have a lot of real specialized organisms like the spotted owl that lives here. From the standpoint of the spotted owl, it may be that everything we've got left isn't enough. There's already too much that's gone for that particular organism to survive over the long run. No one can seriously deny that there are old-growth species that just really aren't going to be able to exist outside old growth. I think that's pretty clear that there are such species.
Biologist Chris Mazur worked for the Bureau of Land Management, which, like the Forest Service, sells timber from public forests.
I love this old tree. Makes it a little bit more real, perhaps.
Mazur left the Bureau to become an independent consultant.
The average trees in the stand are 400 to 600 years. That means they take about 2.5 centuries to decompose and recycle in the soil, which means that the forest really grows on trees. So a forest is really always growing on itself.
Chris, as you know, the Forest Service says that these old-growth forests are full of rotten trees and rotten wood, and that it's a waste to let them sit here and not cut them down and take it out.
There's nothing wasted out here. This wood that we're sitting on eventually will rot and recycle in the soil. That is what forms the organic material. That's what the forest grows on. That's the nutrient capital, a lot of it that becomes stored below ground. If we remove all of the wood from the forest floor, we will eventually greatly impair the ability of the trees to grow. This is the way nature reinvests into the system. Big stumps? Yeah, it is. This is a tree farm, and we call it reforestation. In reality, the trees are renewable. There are no snags, there are no large logs, and when we lose those, we lose a lot of the habitat structure. The cavity nesting birds are not going to be represented here. The small mammals that take the mycorrhizal spores and disperse them throughout the forest are not going to be represented here. What we're doing is we're focusing on the wrong end. This is our focus of what we call forestry, but we're focused on the tree and the product, right? And a forest is not trees. Trees do not make a forest. Trees are only the plant expression of acres that we call forest land. There will never be a forest here again because we are insisting on one plantation after another plantation after another plantation. We don't ever plan to allow nature to heal the processes below ground and to recapitalize the soil nutrients. And in Germany, for example, they've learned that when they have done this 2 rotations, that the productivity begins to decline. But it isn't our problem. It's the future's problem. All we as human beings can do is maintain the options for the next generation. We're spending the options when we liquidate the old growth. Whatever options they have are what we leave them. And an option spend is no longer an option. You can always cut old growth, but once it's cut, we can't grow it back. No one has ever done it.
And we're making all those decisions today.
We're making them today for the dollar. Pure and simple. Nothing else is being taken into account.
Hard figures on the amount of old-growth forest still standing do not exist. Nonetheless, record cutting is continuing. Thus, the nation's reserves of ancient forest may be disappearing faster than anyone up to now has suspected.
Now, there are some new numbers that are coming out that the Wilderness Society is developing on the amount of old growth that exists. And it looks like there's a lot less old growth, real old growth Douglas fir forest than most of us had supposed. One logical strategy might be to try and retain most of the old growth in the larger patches. You probably want to leave those alone so that you retain your options on those for a longer time period. And you darn well, every month, every year that goes by, you're significantly reducing that. Because we take a big block of old growth timber, we may only cut a couple of little pieces out of it, but we'll take the pieces right out of the center so that the whole block loses viability as an old growth unit. So that the need for some change is extreme. It's extremely urgent that we make our decision as a society soon, very soon, this year.
Back in Opal Creek, Monteith brings together the 3 parties most directly involved in the fate of the valley. Joining Attia and Freris is Forest Service District Ranger Dave Alexander. He is directly in charge of Opal Creek, but the Forest Service gets its orders from Washington, D.C. In recent years, Congress has required the Forest Service in this district to cut more timber than the Forest Service recommended.
It's one of the 2 largest units on the sale. I think the largest unit is around 30 acres, so these are not terribly huge harvest units.
So this timber is not unique in its size or its quality or say for some of the values, say spiritual values and solitude and that kind of thing. There are millions of acres that are set aside in wilderness areas in Oregon and Washington today, and there's ample areas for people to enjoy themselves.
Right. If we're practicing true forestry out there, why have we got to log this last watershed in order for you to survive?
In order to have a land base and you have to and maintain a harvest level, you've got to have a certain number of acres. This is part of that land base. If we're not able to cut this area, the cut will be reduced and there'll be fewer mills running.
Could you live with a slightly reduced cut?
No.
So you've got to have this. You just have to have this.
That's right. Where it's located will come to my mill. We have 2 million acres of wilderness areas set aside in Oregon. We have almost 50% of the land base set aside in the Willamette. And you say, why not just this area? We've got 40%. How about this much more? Robbie? What is enough? I feel enough is enough.
It's important that we get a couple of facts here. There's 2 million acres of wilderness in Oregon, and a tenth of that maybe is old growth forest.
A tenth?
A tenth. The point is, if you can't make it without cutting down a place like Opal Creek, I mean, what are you going to do when Opal Creek's gone? It's the last intact forest here.
But you
Why don't
people
you
come up with
operate-
the last of everything?
On this
you know?
district it is.
Okay, let me put
happens
it
to be-
in perspective. When Lewis and Clark came out here, we had 31 million acres of virgin timber.
The way
Now
it
we
is
have
today.
2.5 million. That means that you, as far as industry, has got 92% of the original land base that you've been doing. And if you can't do sustained yield or support your mills on that, then the whole.
nonsense.
If
That's
you need
complete
that last
nonsense.
8%.
The industry is the dominating force in Oregon economy today. It continues to be and always will be.
We are committed to timber management and have been. That should be no secret to you or anyone else from the standpoint that the Willamette is the largest timber-producing national forest in the system.
Well, it's no secret, but it's a tragedy given the fact that you're not providing a sustained yield of the other resources. You simply feel that sustained yield means timber. We'd like to see a sustained yield of water, sustained yield of elk, sustained yield of spotted owls, sustained yield of animals that are going extinct on this forest.
You consider, and almost every special interest group considers, that what is right for them is right for the public, in quotes. There is no one public. Perhaps any one of those groups might represent a large segment of the public, but maybe they don't. The one group that does represent a large segment of the public is called the Congress. And the Congress, for instance, to use Opal Creek as an example, set up processes to look at wilderness and decided that Opal Creek wasn't going to be a wilderness as recently as 1984. You know, I began my career in the mid to late 60s. You really didn't find people with a high degree of anxiety about national forest land because I believe at that time the impression was that everything could be carried out everywhere. We can have it all. Over the last couple of decades, it's become more and more clear that we can't have it all. That the national forests are in fact a finite piece of land, albeit a large one in a national scope, and that some of the uses that occur on those national forests are also finite. And that starts to focus in on issues like old growth. A lot of our disagreements begin to focus around those deep-held values of what each of our special interests are and the recognition that in the final solution, maybe none of us are going to get exactly what we wanted. Opal Creek is kind of a microcosm of that to me. It's a good focal point that explains some of the complexities of the issues of old growth throughout the Cascades and in the Northwest in general. And the way that we resolve Opal Creek, in some ways, will be indicative of the ways that we can resolve that bigger issue, I think. You agree with that?
There is so much out here to learn. And you know, we look back 20 years at what we've learned in that period that we didn't have the foggiest notion about. And you say, geez, boy, I thought I was smart then. I didn't even see this. I didn't even know that. Now, what are we going to learn in the next 10 years, Jim? Right. The next 20 years, the next 40 years? This place is a treasure house. And we don't know the first thing about it.
North Africa at one time was forested. Greece was forested. The Middle East was forested. The central part of the Mediterranean was forested. Today, they don't have forests. We're losing the forest here. China has lost their forest. We're cutting out the Amazon. And in Europe today, they don't know what forest they even had. So they're going back to paintings from the 14 and 1500s, trying to piece it together. I see hope because we have the chance, in my opinion, probably the last chance here in the Northwest and in southwestern Canada to learn how to sustain a temperate forest. We've got very fertile soils, a very gentle climate, clean air. We know more about our forest than anywhere else in the world, and we've got good people. What we don't have is the foresight, the will, and the right political climate to do this. But if we lose it here, in my opinion, humanity loses it because there's no place else that I know of that we can still do that. We can do it here, and that's our choice.
We have 7.5 million acres of old growth in Oregon and Washington. We're not going to run out now or in the future. And the question is whether we use our land, whether we manage our lands, or we don't.
I have a real hard time trying to deal with the idea of this being cut. Actually, I don't even accept it as a reality. I have no idea what I would do if they actually started with the chainsaws. It would probably push me pretty close over the edge. They're probably going to lock me up before they're going to be able to take it. This is yours. This is my grandchildren's and your children's. And if we don't fight for it, it won't be here. And hopefully, we'll win the battle. Or I'll be able to win the battle this time around, but if not, your guys are gonna have to fight for it.
Well, you don't have to be an expert to perceive that once a forest of 400-year-old trees is cut down, that forest is lost forever. In his first inaugural address, President Thomas Jefferson spoke of his concern for posterity, for the thousandth generation of Americans to come. He was thinking about us. Are we thinking about our children and grandchildren? This nation needs lumber, but there are millions of acres of timber in the United States beside ancient forests. Speaking for myself, I'd say that wherever forests of ancient trees are still standing, as in Opal Creek, we ought to be saving them. These forests belong to the American people, and you have to let Congress know what you want done with them.
Since this program was completed, federal courts, as a result of suits brought by environmentalists, have prevented many timber sales in the Northwest. However, Congress effectively overruled these court actions by prohibiting the courts from issuing injunctions that delay timber sales. The effect of this is that the Forest Service can offer Opal Creek timber for sale at any time. The government has also declared the spotted owl a threatened species, which will probably reduce the timber cut somewhat. Bills are presently pending in Congress, which would halt logging in all ancient forests and ban log exports. Most of the timber industry is fighting to defeat these measures.
This Audubon special is made possible by the people of GE. GE, from plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life.
Video cassettes of this program for educational use may be purchased by writing to PBS Video. Home video sales are not available through this offer.
This is PBS.
The companion book to the Audubon television specials, called Audubon Perspectives, Fight for Survival, is available in bookstores and libraries nationwide.